Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. In the first hour, we're going to spend some time getting into a number of the really difficult issues related to things like human trafficking. We're going to talk a little bit about voodoo and everything. It all comes from this new book, which is a thriller, the Trevor Black novel series. We'll be talking about that with our good friend Craig Parshall. But I might mention in the second hour, we're going to come back to the conversation we had yesterday about Billy Graham, and we have the biographer for Billy Graham on in the second hour, William Martin. Many years ago, he wrote a book called A Prophet with Honor. That came out, I think, in 1991. Well, they're going to re-release that through Zondervan, so we'll be talking with him. And as we always like to do at all these various venues and opportunities, give you a chance to join our conversation today. That number is 1-800-351-1212. I'd love to hear some of your comments about Billy Graham, the influence he's had in your life. And, of course, William Martin will have some critical things to say if you've seen the Washington Post article today or some of the others that have surfaced. Sure, even George Will's column today, really. But we will get into all of that and, of course, provide a platform for that discussion. Craig Parshall should not be a stranger to any of you that have been listening to this program any length of time. Of course, a lawyer, also a fiction writer, an individual that has argued cases before the Supreme Court. He's also, of course, married to Janet Parshall, who we think so highly of, one of the best talk show hosts in the business. And, of course, many of his books have shown up on the New York Times bestseller list, on the CBA bestseller list, serves also as special counsel with the American Center for Law and Justice. Craig Parshall, always a delight to have you on the program with us.
Oh, likewise, Kerby. Good to talk to you.
We're going to spend some time talking about everything from human trafficking, maybe a little bit of voodoo and the occult. A little bit later, I do want to get into the John Milton Project because, if no other reason, every time we're with you, we've talked about that. And over these last few months, I've been quoting you occasionally, without you being on, about what's been happening at Google and YouTube and all sorts of other things. So we'll get into that, and I think it relates very much to this book. But for our listeners that are not familiar with the series, the Trevor Black series, ex-attorney. Tell us a little bit of a background before we get into this book.
Well, you know, Trevor Black is one of these high-flying criminal defense attorneys listed as the in the top tier, maybe top 10 in the city of New York City from a fictional standpoint. But he's rolling high. You know, the guy drives a $200,000 Austin Martin, and he's got a trophy wife, and everything seems to be going great. He represents a lot of very seedy and some very evil criminal defendants, but then that's the business of criminal law, right? And then something happens in his life, both personally and professionally, begins to sort of unravel, and then quickly unravels, and finds himself, he kind of fashions it as the Jimmy Stewart prayer in It's a Wonderful Life, sitting at the counter saying, God, I need some help down here. I'm in a mess, and makes a faith decision that changes not only his life and his attorney, but also gives him kind of an unusual spiritual gift. He can actually not just know that there's an evil empire out there supernaturally that we can't see, but he can actually see into it. He can see what's behind those people who are instigated by demonic forces. He sees it in all its ugly glory and power. So he just decides, well, his license goes the way of the dodo bird, unfortunately. He's no longer allowed to practice law, and so he decides that God has called him to fight the supernatural elements of evil out there with the power of the Holy Spirit and hopefully some discernment. And in this book, The Empowered, he finds himself up against what he says are kind of higher-level executive types in the demonic realm,
Right.
and he thinks he's found himself a match that is above his pay grade.
One of the cut lines here is, when evil is allowed to take hold, what can one man do to stop the assault from such a hideous empire? And, of course, all these books are kind of page-turners, but I don't think we're giving too much away, because this is at least on the book jacket here, that you have this death in Washington, D.C., and it's a voodoo death. So that, of course, takes him, no longer is he in New York, no longer is he in Washington, D.C. He goes to the New Orleans Bayou. And talk about that, because then you've got a number of twists and turns that make it even more personal for him, don't you?
Yeah, a lot of us think of New Orleans, Louisiana area as kind of the heartbeat of the voodoo culture in the United States. As a matter of fact, Smithsonian Magazine, just to show you that it's currently being embraced as just a kind of a fascinating cultural phenomenon, right? That there's really no occultic harm in following or getting involved in voodoo. Front cover of the Smithsonian Magazine about a year ago talked about this wonderful sacred experience of voodoo, and they focused on a lot of folks down who practice it in the New Orleans area. But the interesting thing is, when I wrote this, with the murder beginning in Washington, D.C., a high-profile federal prosecutor looks like he's been done in by a voodoo hex, you'd think, well, that doesn't fit Washington, D.C. Of course, this is, the height of intellectual power and prestige and political influence. You don't really think of those marbled halls up there harboring voodoo adherents. And then after the book comes out, right at the cusp of it being released, Kerby, we get this news that Sally Quinn, a reporter for the Washington Post, a celebrity writer for them, and married to the Washington Post editor, Ben Bradley, had been practicing voodoo herself, and in fact says in her memoir recently that she cast voodoo hexes on people, with the result that several of them died, according to her. So this is a phenomenon that is not just locally and culturally relegated to Louisiana or the bayous or New Orleans. It's really kind of gone national. But I loved the opportunity, frankly, of hop, skipping, and jumping our hero, Trevor Black, from Washington, D.C. down into New Orleans in the French Quarter, which is, of course, steeped in a lot of voodoo history, and then into the backwater bayous where he finds out that there's something very, very evil going on involving human trafficking of young girls and the use of something that is new-fashioned with an old-fashioned evil, and that is the dark web portion of the Internet. That's kind of the criminal back alley where all things criminal are traded and bought and sold.
Well, again, we'll take a break, and when I come back, I want to talk about how this becomes personal for him and how that ties into human trafficking, because obviously human trafficking is broader than the voodoo connection, but we'll get that in just a minute. But I just, before we take a break, just always remark that Joel Rosenberg and Craig Parshall both oftentimes write books that then end up almost being prophetic. And here you've written about voodoo in Washington, D.C., and then we, of course, hear about Sally Quinn. And so I think that's kind of an intriguing kind of connection there as well. But how does this relate to this individual in the fictional book, Trevor Black, and how does that relate to human trafficking? We'll come back and talk about that. And then, of course, we'll move away from the book to the principles behind it. And human trafficking is a $1 billion a year industry. And 80% of those bought, sold, and imprisoned in this underground sex service industry are women and children. And so we're going to talk about what that means, and certainly one of the great concerns that we can use this book to highlight, something we've talked about on this program before, but we're going to come back to it as well. And as we go along, if you'd like to join our conversation, feel free to do so. That number is 1-800-351-1212. The new novel, Empowered, The Empowered by Craig Parshall. We'll talk more about it and how you can get a copy right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, a wise consumer of news and information should question some of the statistics thrown out by journalists. This is especially true since an advocacy group may have provided these statistics in order to influence public opinion. Here's one example. Tulane University says that 41% of the undergraduate women have been sexually assaulted since arriving on campus. That's an alarming statistic that seems to be contrary to common sense. If there were that many assaults, we would be hearing about what a dangerous place this college is to any woman. When you dig into the statistics, you find that Tulane broadly defines sexual assault. We're talking about any unwanted sexual contact. The survey also includes lots of people who were self-selecting themselves for the survey. Just a bit of skepticism and discernment would tell you that the 41% figure could not possibly be correct. Another example has been the statistics for school shootings. Even before the tragic shooting in Florida, there were people questioning the criteria used to compile school shooting incidents. Daniel Lee, writing in the Wall Street Journal, challenged the claim that there had been 11 school shootings just in the month of January. The only one some might remember was a shooting at a Kentucky high school. But what about the other 10? Well, if you look at the database put together by a gun control group, you see lots of incidents that don't qualify as a school shooting. A school bus window was broken by a pellet gun in Iowa. A gun accidentally discharged in a weapons class in a Texas community college. A veteran with PTSD shot himself in a parking lot of a closed Michigan school. No students were present. The point is simple. Don't trust every statistic. We need some healthy skepticism and discernment when it comes to news and information. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13. Samson, now playing. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Craig Parshall with us today, and again, the book is entitled The Empowered, and it is published by Tyndale. Let me just mention that you no doubt will be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if you also want to go to the website to click on the picture there of Craig Parshall, it will take you to craigparshallauthor.com, and then you can find out about the new release as well as some of the other books and resources, and you don't even have to know how to spell his name because we've got all the links there as well. And if you are interested in contacting him or finding out more about him, there's all sorts of information on his website, which you can find simply by going to our website, pointofview.net. Okay, Craig, let's get into the issue of human trafficking. This goes from being an investigation into voodoo to something that becomes real personal to Trevor Black, right?
Yeah, he ends up getting a family member who insists on kind of traipsing along with him on this investigation, gets swept into the center of this enterprise, and it becomes, of course, very, very personal for Trevor Black, the father now, not just the ex-criminal defense attorney who has decided to take on the unseen empire. And what I try to do in these books, as you know, Kerby, is put a lot of fact in.
Yes, you do.
You know, I like having a good ride for the reader, but I want it to be more than just a roller coaster that ends up at the same place where it started. I want some information because this stuff is real. One of the reasons I picked voodoo as an example as a starting point is because the more I researched it, the more I found that there were some very violent subsects of voodoo which have been involved in human trafficking and even human sacrifice. You don't see that talked about on Smithsonian Magazine.
No.
They talk about the sacred cultural aspect of voodoo, but it's out there. In fact, the UN a number of years ago actually had released a report saying that they were very concerned about the convergence between voodoo and child abduction and actual child human sacrifice in some of those ceremonies. So there's a very, very dark side to that, as there is to all occult practices, of course, and there seems to be a huge appetite, particularly in the United States, for all things occult. So the danger is obviously there. And on the human trafficking issue, a lot of us, myself included, really, before I started looking into this question, I would have presumed that the majority of people who are coerced or forced into human trafficking, and most of that ends up into a form of criminal sex trafficking, are brought into the United States from other countries. Either they came in illegally or they came in legally, but they're part of a illegal community, and they're forced in that way. In fact, the vast majority, according to every study that's looked at this, the vast majority of victims in the United States of human trafficking are U.S. citizens.
Yes.
And an increasing number are young middle school-aged girls. In fact, there's a very troubling story that came out of Sacramento. It actually ended up to be one of those thank you, God stories because they were rescued. But in Sacramento, California, a 15-year-old girl and a 17-year-old girl, they were buddies, had lied to their parents about what they were doing this weekend. And, the old routine. One girl says, I'm staying at the other girl's house, and vice versa. Parents don't know anything different, don't check into it. And lo and behold, they've got a first-class ticket from Sacramento to go to New York City. And thank goodness the ticket counter agent, this woman, took a look at the young girls. There was something very off about this whole situation. She looked at the ticket. They were only one-way tickets. So she did some checking into the credit card that had been used. The credit card was a third party who would pay for the tickets, and the credit card used was suspicious in terms of possibly being stolen.
Yes.
So she brings in the security people. They question these girls. They come clean. They had met a guy on Instagram, right, on online communications who said, thousands of dollars I'm going to give you. You come out to New York City. Easy modeling job. I'm going to put you in a rock video, and then we're going to send you home. Well, and I know that wouldn't have happened. They were probably spared being forced into human trafficking the rest of their life or something worse.
And again, we're talking about 300,000 Americans, primarily. Like you said, some are from other countries, but so many of them, a good number of them under the age of 18. And so, first of all, there is a real warning, Craig, before we even get back to the book for just a minute, about having some kind of monitoring of what your children have access to. And I've always said, parents, if you've got a kid that's got Facebook, you need to be a Facebook friend. If they're on Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter or whatever it might be, you got to just pay a little bit of attention, because they don't know that when they're interacting with a young boy they think at the age of 18 who wants them to come across town, that really it's a 35-year-old who has other intents. Or in this case, they think that there is going to be somebody who's going to give them lots of money for modeling and is actually going to put them into the sex traffic trade. We just need to be really much more vigilant about what is coming into our homes and going into the minds of our kids.
Boy, that's a powerful word, because it's so true. About a year and a half ago, I had the privilege, in my capacity as special counsel to the American Center for Law and Justice, to work for Jay Sekulow and a number of the attorneys there on a case that we had down in Georgia. The state of Georgia asked us to defend their law that was under attack. Their law simply said, look, if an adult uses the Internet as a means of trying to entice a person under the age of 18 into illicit activity, then that's a crime. Now, you and I would think that's a no-brainer, right? That kind of a law clearly has to be constitutional. Well, lo and behold, a suspected alleged predator, a guy who was much older, had enticed a young girl over the Internet on a messaging board to start talking about first what happened in high school last week and so forth, and then, of course, starting to approach sexual things. And you know what the next step would be? The next step would be, let's meet, and then the girl disappears. Well,
yes.
It was stopped short of that. The police got involved. The alleged perpetrator was arrested. He defends it on the grounds, well, this is First Amendment, right? My right to use online communications with a minor about sexual matters. Well, the Supreme Court of Georgia, I'm happy to announce, agreed with us that the statute was legal, constitutional, will continue to be enforced, and kids will continue to be safe. But the lesson is exactly what you pointed out. Before we get to that point, parents, find out, number one, what your kids are doing online, and then number two, go to some of these services that will provide parents with tools to limit the access of their kids to certain sites they don't want them to go to.
And again, one other aspect of that, which you just alluded to, is we can pass some laws which stand constitutional muster, don't eliminate a person's free speech rights or their First Amendment rights, but at the same time have some kind of control so that they don't use those First Amendment rights to lure people into the sex trafficking trade.
Yeah. In fact, there are a number of organizations. I had the privilege of doing some work with a group called Enough is Enough. Donna Rice Hughes founded it, where they work with Google and a lot of these companies like Microsoft to encourage them to keep building tools so that parents have the ability to limit the online access that their kids might have to evildoers out there. And, of course, the bad thing about the Internet, I mean, there are a lot of good things about communications platforms on the Internet, but there are bad things. The bad thing is their anonymity. You could disguise not only who you are, but where you're posting from. You can create a fake IP address and make it look like you're calling from France, and in fact, you're in the next neighborhood.
Well, again, let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation on not only the Internet, but we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the dark web. I have a commentary coming out next week, interesting enough, about that, and maybe Craig Parshall will add to it or maybe even help me clarify what I've already written and recorded. But again, if you would like to join the conversation, maybe you've been concerned about this as well, and we are talking today about everything from voodoo to sex trafficking to the dangers on the Internet. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about his piece that he did with the National Religious Broadcasters. It was called the John Milton Project for Free Speech. And we've expressed in the past some of the concerns about how free speech sometimes works for the liberals and progressives, but sometimes is limited to the conservatives and especially the Christians. And we've had examples of that in terms of Apple apps or YouTube videos or a variety of other things. And certainly, Craig Parshall has been addressing that issue. Of course, we talked about it just a few days ago with John Whitehead as well. So we've got all sorts of topics to put on the table. But if you would like to join the conversation, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. The book that is just out is called The Empowered, and it's a Trevor Black novel, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But we also have a link to CraigParshallAuthor.com, and you can go to our website, pointofview.net, to find the link and all the other information necessary if you wanted to order the book from him. Of course, you can find it in your bookstore. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Craig Parshall. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Any concerns you have about the online chats that your children are having right now with other individuals? What are you doing to monitor? Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. The newest book out in the Trevor Black series, The Empowered, 450 pages, published by Tyndall. Should be able to find it in your local bookstore. I mentioned some others, The Occupied, The Accused. If you go to your website, Craig, you have information about a lot of those books. I saw one picture there with you and your daughter, Sarah, who I understand is also an author. So you've got about the most talented family I can imagine.
Not only a daughter, but an author, yes.
Yeah. So between Janet Parshall, Craig Parshall, now Sarah, and a few others, wouldn't you like to be around the dining room table with this family, because so much brain power and so much creativity. It's fascinating to always get to know each one of you. And let's, if we can, get into another part of the internet. Many of us think that the internet already has some dark corridors, but there is a thing called the dark web. And that's, if I can try to explain it simply, and maybe I'll miss here, it's where you have to use specialized software where it's concealed from other individuals, and it's used by criminals, it's used by terrorists, and that's another aspect that surfaces a little bit in the book, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. I actually went through one portal, and it's not that difficult to get into it. I went through one portal that got me just one step closer. I didn't want to voyage into the dark web itself because it's also trafficked by law enforcement people, happily, who try to observe the criminal activities and enterprises that take place there. But once you get into it, and it's not impossible to get in. In fact, a smart teenager could probably install the software and get in one step farther than I did, and really find out that he could buy everything from illegal drugs to illegal weapons to, in fact, purchasing human beings that are involved in the human trafficking enterprise. So it is a nasty place, and the problem is the anonymity that is permitted in the dark web, because, in fact, I alluded to that a couple seconds ago, where you can create fake IP addresses, you can be entirely anonymous, and law enforcement has some techniques to be able to trace where some of these likely perpetrators are that are posting things online. They even have manuals on how to commit certain crimes. If you're a novice and you want to be a professional criminal, here's how to be a hitman, here's how to be a burglar, and so forth. So now Congress has not been silent on this. There's several bills pending. One of them specifically addresses the dark web and says if you have a platform that is used for any purpose by a third party, this would even include things like Facebook and Google and Apple's iTunes store and so forth. If any online platform like that permits the use of that platform by those who engage in human trafficking, and they knew or should have known that it was being used in that way, then they can be either civilly or criminally liable. Now, that's a bill pending. There's a lot of pushback from the Silicon Valley people, because their attitude is, don't touch anything on the internet, particularly the dark web, because, well, once you start regulating that, you're going to start regulating us. We don't want that. So the argument, and there's some appeal to this until you look at the facts, the argument that they pose for non-regulation of the dark web, why don't we just outlaw it, and that's what most people would say, is because then you shut down the FBI and the local law enforcement's ability to track people. Well, the problem with that in terms of human trafficking is what you're saying is we're going to let our 13 and 14-year-olds get kidnapped, abducted, and sold online so we might be able to catch some guy illegally selling pot in another part of the dark web. I'm not willing to have that kind of trade-off. I don't know about you.
Well, yeah, and I've heard the same thing on trying to catch terrorists, and the rest is that if you spook everybody off of that, then you would miss an opportunity. There are ways in which, by using very sophisticated techniques, we can track criminals, we can track terrorists, And as you said, the focus that we have today, maybe even track human traffickers so that we can rescue some of these girls that have been entrapped by these individuals who intend them harm and intend to make as much profit off of their bodies as they can.
Yeah, and I really think, Kerby, because this is such a reality, I mean, they estimate that upwards of 100,000 persons in the United States at any one time are swept into this as victims, usually coerced or threatened with physical force. Sometimes a lot of this involving middle school girls and young children is accomplished by saying, if you call the authorities, if you try to run away, we know where your parents are, we'll kill them all. And to a child, to a 13 or 14-year-old, that's a very deadly threat. And so very often that's the psychological pressure to keep them. But on the other hand, there are success stories. Just a couple months ago, the FBI released the results of a very long and successful sting operation where they swept into their net about 80 adult perpetrators of human trafficking engaged in using young people for sex trafficking, and they were able to save, upwards of like 90 kids. Some of them were very, very young, very small children involved in this trade, if you can believe that. So there are success stories. Our government and our law enforcement people are awake to this. But I think the average person out there, you and I and others, need to know that it's out there. It's not just a third world country problem in Thailand. It's right here. And we have to know some of the signals, some of the clues that maybe one of the kids in our neighborhood might be involved.
Well, and again, I just think back a couple of years, maybe a decade ago, where we had maybe former Congresswoman Linda Smith on and shared hope, or you mentioned Donna Rice, and enough is enough. And I would have people calling and saying, if this is a real problem, why am I not hearing about this in the news? Well, we started hearing a lot more about it, and so now we have Noel Boucher of Pure Hope and others. When we talk about it, this is no longer one of those things where we think, well, it happens in other countries, but it doesn't happen here. So the good news is we're learning a lot more about that. So certainly education is part of that process. But I thought before we move on to another topic, in studying all this area of human trafficking, you mentioned one thing that was new to you, and that is that it was so much of Americans, not foreigners. Did you learn some other things that parents need to know about this issue of human trafficking?
Yeah, and I think we've already touched on it, but we can't hit it hard enough. And that is with the advent of websites, Instagram and Twitter, that kids are often approached in some way initially on online communications. A number of years ago, a study was done, how do young females who get brought into the sex trade trafficking problem, how are they first initiated into it? And only 14% originally were contacted online. That number has increased exponentially. Now, almost a majority of young females who are ultimately coerced into this trade, abducted or otherwise, have had some online contact. As a matter of fact, once they're under the authority, physically or otherwise, of an adult perpetrator, very often then there will be an online communication with their identity obscured, obviously, but they're fed into the child porn industry and some other avenues. So it's absolutely critical that folks understand the connection between the Internet and their children and their safety. The other thing is it really hides in plain sight. Things like schoolyards and bus stops and truck stops. In fact, a truckers organization has recently been talking to lawmakers in Washington, D.C. about trying to patrol truck stops because this has been a frequent entree for people to be either sold, bought, or swept into it.
Well, we need to take a break, and when we come back, we will focus just a little bit of time and attention on what's called the John Milton Project for Free Speech. And you can go to nrb.org/JMP, or again, we can give you some of those links. because we've been concerned about what we call viewpoint censorship on the internet. And some of this started at Apple and then Facebook and a variety of other places. And we thought that would be helpful for you to know as well. This is something that certainly Craig Parshall was a part of when he was at the National Religious Broadcasters, and still, I'm sure, continues looking at. And they actually even published a white paper a number of years ago on true liberty in a new media age. So, again, if you want to know some more about that, it is something we've talked about, whether it has been how they've censored the Manhattan Declaration, for example, or more recently, some of the conversation we've had with Dennis Prager and YouTube, or a variety of others. So we're going to get into that as well. So even though the internet is a great place to get information, there's some really dark back alleys, and there's also censorship. So how do we think about this, especially since these entities, they're not government entities, but they use government services. So we'll think our way through that and talk about it right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Sometimes we think that the judicial system can and will solve all of our disputes. A recent case from the Court of Appeals of Ohio says there are some things even a court cannot decide. A Roman Catholic institution in Ohio recently dismissed a student studying for the priesthood following an investigation into allegations of moral misconduct. The student, understandably upset, sued the school for breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and other charges. On appeal, the state court in Ohio explained that courts may only adjudicate those matters involving a subject matter courts are authorized to consider. Courts are permitted to evaluate secular disputes, but the doctrine of ecclesiastical abstention prevents courts from settling disputes involving purely doctrinal and ecclesiastical matters. Here, the court explained, all of the claims alleged stemmed from a dispute by a religious organization over matters of church doctrine. Any resolution would, necessarily, require the court to evaluate religious doctrine, a task courts that are ill-prepared to undertake. The judicial system has broad jurisdiction over matters ranging from simple misdemeanors to complex commercial transactions. Yet it is right and proper that courts have limits. The ecclesiastical abstention doctrine highlights those limitations, showcasing along the way the inherent deference that courts have for religious bodies to govern their own religious affairs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Learn more and request a free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org and get your free In God We Trust window cling.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Craig Parshall with us for a few more minutes. If you would like to join us, feel free to do so. In the second hour, we're going to be talking with William Martin about Billy Graham. I'd love to get your comments then as well. The newest book is called The Empowered, a Trevor Black novel. I might also mention The Occupied, The Accused, and Others. And just before we go, though, I would like to, Craig, talk a little bit about this National Religious Broadcasters John Milton Project for Free Speech. I know that was something you worked at when you were there. And when we look at kind of the big five, it's Apple, it's Facebook, it's Google, it's Twitter, it's YouTube. Again, these are not government agencies, but at the same time, they use the internet, and there has been a fair amount of censorship of various things, whether it's at the Apple App Store. I mentioned the Manhattan Declaration in that particular app, whether it's Dennis Prager or others that have had their YouTube videos either limited, or whether it's certain things that will or will not show up on Google, or even attempts to remove certain content from Facebook. This is a concern, and I know you've been actually at the forefront of this for years. So kind of where are we right now in terms of this ongoing debate and discussion?
It has been going on for at least a decade. I think that it was about a decade ago that I saw the potential. There hadn't been any censorship at the time, but I saw the potential of these platforms because they are private entities, and they were really quickly obtaining monopoly status, which means they didn't really care what anybody had to say about whether they liked their activities or not. There was a potential for censorship, and so I launched what we called back then the John Milton Project, named after Milton, because when the printing press was coming out, and it had been out for about 100 years, England decided, oh, no, we're going to license every person who owns a printing press, because this could be dangerous. You know, they could say stuff against the government that we don't like. So Parliament said, okay, we're going to look at licensing every printing press. John Milton, famous poet who wrote from a Christian worldview, said, well, you know, good ideas rise, bad ideas fall, but that only works in a free marketplace of ideas. You cannot license printing presses that way, because you'll stifle basically free speech. Well, now we have the Internet, which is really the 21st century printing press. You had mentioned a couple of those instances of censorship. If these platforms, like let's say Facebook, is audacious enough to block and remove the Facebook page of Governor Mike Huckabee, I mean, a man known around the world, a powerful political figure, censor him, block him because they didn't like what he had to say about traditional marriage. If Twitter is willing, as they did recently, to take Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn's ad, she's running for the United States Senate to replace Bob Corker, who's retiring in the Senate, and she happened to say in one of her ads on Twitter that you know, she didn't like Planned Parenthood because, after all, they trade in baby parts. They said, no, that's inflammatory, and they took her down. They blocked her ad. So if they're audacious enough to block these national politicians and national figures, what do you think they'll do to the average person with viewpoints they don't like? So this is a huge problem. Now, you've put your finger on the paradox here, and that is the First Amendment only applies to restrain the censoring activities of the government, whether it's local, state, or federal. But these are not government entities. These are private companies, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, and so forth. So what do we do about that? Well, there are a number of legal theories. None of them have been used very successfully to challenge this act of censorship. But there is currently a bill right now by Marsha Blackburn, by the way, pending in Congress, don't know where it'll go, that is the first entree, the first touch point where she is suggesting maybe these outfits like Twitter, Facebook, and Google need to at least be transparent about their privacy policies so that customers and users will know whether or not their personal information is being sold, as an example. That's the first time anyone has looked at these companies. They all fall in the category, technically, of edge providers because they're kind of on the edge of the Internet. They flourish because, you know, like a superhighway, you can only get to them like a service plaza by getting on the Internet and then getting into these, you know, sites like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and so forth, and Apple. So she is suggesting perhaps it's time to look at them in a way to be regulatory entities. You know, telephones have been regulated since the 20th century as social utilities. There's arguments both ways on this, and I'm not arguing that perhaps we should expand federal regulations to include these companies. But I think there at least has to be a national conversation with these companies, which is something I tried to do up on Capitol Hill in Washington for years. And I've had a couple of brave souls. One was a high-ranking executive with Amazon, who was brave enough to come on to one of our roundtable discussions in Washington to openly discuss these issues. But most of them are hiding in the shadows. They have a powerful presence in Washington, but they don't want to be heard or seen publicly on this issue. So I think it's time for a conversation. What moral and social obligation do they have to the American people? Because they're not selling refrigerators or designer clothes. They're trafficking in our opinions, our viewpoints, our email communications. That's what made them billions of dollars. What obligation then do they have to us not to censor our viewpoints as long as they're otherwise lawful?
Well, again, I think it's a conversation that needs to take place. Of course, we've had conversations about everything from net neutrality to a variety of other things on the Internet. Why not this one? So let me just, before we run out of time, mention that we have a link to your website, CraigParshallAuthor.com. Now, when they go there, they can find about your books. Let me just mention the blog as well, because today we've talked about the dark web. I know a number of months ago you wrote about that. You wrote about voodoo, a variety of other issues. So if people would like to know more about you, if they would like to get all of the books, of course, this one that we're talking about today, 450 pages, published by Tyndale House, which you should be able to find in your local bookstore. But if not, you can find it there. I mentioned some of the others, The Occupied, The Accused, and many others. Or if they'd like to contact you, there is all sorts of information at your website. But give us a quick tour. What do we find when we land at CraigParshallAuthor.com?
Well, at the top, you're going to have some information with background. And by the way, I was privileged to have some wonderful endorsers for The Empowered, my most recent novel.
Yes.
But one of them was somebody you had mentioned, which is Linda Smith, who was a former congresswoman and who has really taken up the banner against human trafficking around the world, but certainly in the United States. She is the founder and president of an organization called Shared Hope International, which tries to suppress and outlaw all forms of human trafficking. You'll find some information about that book, and then the preceding Trevor Black book, which is The Occupied, as well as some of the activities, book reviews, articles from me that I've published. And then at the bottom, as you indicated, in addition to all the other books that I've written, a number of blogs on a wide variety of issues, and hopefully they'll find out whether or not they have an interest in delving into the supernatural mission that Trevor Black has in finding that evil is not just a sociological problem, it's a spiritual issue.
Well, again, Craig Parshall, always great to have you on the program. Say hi to Janet, and thank you for writing so many exciting novels, as well as some of the nonfiction books as well, and it's always great to have you on the program Point of View.
Kerby, it's always a pleasure.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Billy Graham. And William Martin, I should say, is an individual that a number of years ago wrote the book A Prophet with Honor. I understand Zondervan's going to re-release that. Maybe it's going to be updated. Probably will be, because after all, there's been some other things in Billy Graham's life since 1991. So I would imagine that would be the case. And we've got all sorts of comments. William Martin today in the Washington Post. Divorce, drugs, drinking, Billy Graham's children and their absent fathers. I want to ask him about that. We also have George Will saying, Billy Graham, he was not a prophet and he was not a theologian. But we've had some real positive ones. Cal Thomas, the Billy Graham I knew. So this next hour, we're going to talk about Billy Graham, and we welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, from his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at samson.movie.
Missing a day of Point of View is like Samson losing his hair. Now stay with me. Without his hair, Samson was weak, and ultimately he lost his sight. Without Point of View, you miss out on encouraging news, stories of how God is using Christians to make a difference. Instead of being strengthened, you get discouraged. And Point of View helps you see places to get involved, opportunities to apply your God-given gifts for good. Never miss a program, a Viewpoint's commentary, an important action item when you download the Point of View radio app, free from Google Play or iTunes. Take out your phone right now and download the Point of View radio app. See the difference you can make.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about Billy Graham. Of course, with his death, we focused some time and attention on it yesterday. Interestingly enough, we had our Millennial Roundtable, and it is, I think, an illustration of how different generations know Billy Graham in different ways, because those of you that were older that called in had been to a crusade, had read one of his books or many of his books, watched him on television. My younger millennials around the table maybe knew the name, but had never been to a crusade, never seen him on television, maybe only knew him by reputation. And so we thought it would be good to spend a little more time on that. And one of the people we quoted yesterday was Dr. William Martin, and we are privileged to have him with us today. He has been a biographer of Billy Graham, and those of us that are older remember when his book, A Prophet with Honor, came out in 1991. Which is a long time ago, but as you will see as you go to our website, we have a link to the fact that Zondervan is now releasing an updated edition of that, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to introduce this man to a whole new generation of individuals. And Dr. Martin, if you're not familiar, is a fellow in religion and public policy at the Baker Institute at Rice University. Has a master's degree as well as a bachelor's degree from Abilene Christian, also has a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School and a PhD from Harvard University. Has been teaching at Rice for all these years and joins us now by phone. Dr. Martin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I appreciate your interest, and I'm happy to talk with you.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about the title, A Prophet with Honor. You've got all sorts of people writing about it today, but I got a kick out of George Will. I like George Will, but this one he said, well, Billy Graham was not a prophet, and he was not a theologian. So maybe in some respects, after seeing some of the negative things said about Billy Graham today, this younger generation, especially on the looking through the lens of LGBT and things like that, aren't as maybe enthralled with Billy Graham as the previous generation. What are your thoughts?
Well, I can understand that. I think you're right. But just to go back to the title, the title that I wanted for the book was Evangelist, the Billy Graham story.
Yes.
Because he claimed to be more an evangelist rather than a prophet. But as you may know, authors don't always get to choose the titles. And my editor thought A Prophet with Honor, working, of course, against a prophet without honor in his own country,
right,
from the Bible, but thought this is a beautiful title, and it was hard for me to disagree with that, although I did have the kind of reservation that that wasn't exactly what he claimed. On the other hand, he did have a prophetic voice in a number of ways. That the way I have put it, and I think it's apt, is that while Billy Graham was not always, or was not usually at the head of the parade, he was almost always in front of his unit and heading in the right direction. So that on things like segregation, he criticized Martin Luther King when he got out too far, he thought, when he was causing, when he was being imprisoned, and he thought he was causing, Mr. Graham thought he was causing too much trouble. And yet he had brought Martin Luther King to speak, to give prayer at his 1957 Madison Square Garden Great Crusade, at the time when Martin Luther King was directing the boycott in Montgomery, and talked to the crowd about leading a great movement. And people said he lost many admirers at that time, but he wouldn't back down, and never backed down. In fact, he hired an African-American associate evangelist at that time.
That's right.
And In other ways, he spoke. He called for SALT 10 for a full nuclear disarmament at a time when that was not all that popular. So I don't think it's wrong to call Billy Graham a prophet. I'm content with that title, and I think it's a terrific title, frankly.
As a matter of fact, when Cal Thomas's column came out, the Billy Graham I Knew, he had a paragraph where he said, Billy Graham ended racially segregated seating in the Southern Crusades long before it became fashionable. And, of course, you mentioned, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the others. Matter of fact, King at one time said, you take the stadiums, I'll take the streets. So those are all in the plus column. But let's give a little bit of history. I think, again, for our young listeners, they don't know that here is an individual, grew up on a dairy farm, loved baseball. At the age of 16, finds Christ at a tent revival, but never really saw himself, at least initially, as a preacher or a teacher, but eventually grew into that role. What else can you add to the story of Billy Graham?
Well, like a lot of young men, including me, he was fascinated by preachers, and when the opportunity did come to him to preach, well, revivals came through his town, and frequently the revivalists who would stay maybe for weeks would stay at his family home. And then when he went to Florida Bible Institute, which was on a former country club, and it also had rooms for people, and when traveling preachers, perhaps in the off-season, some of the very famous ones would come, he would spend time around them and talk to them and shine their shoes and so forth. So he had this fascination and also was exposed to some of the leading revivalist preachers of his time. And I think he had that took with him. While he was at Florida Bible, the dean of the school said that, and Billy was starting to preach and doing it very well.
Mm-hmm.
The dean says, Billy just wants to do some great thing for God. He doesn't know what it is yet, but he wants to do it.
Well, let's get him then to Wheaton College. And in your piece that you had come out yesterday, you talk about how Billy Graham and Ruth Bale actually met at Wheaton College in the fall of 1940, but it was kind of rocky because she had grown up as a daughter of medical missionaries. They were Presbyterian and really felt the call back to China. She'd grown up in China, wanted to go to Tibet. He didn't have any call in that regard, so there was kind of a little bit of a back and forth until they got married in 1943 because they were, in some respects, both in ministry but going in very different directions for a while, weren't they?
That's correct. And in addition to that, Ruth Graham was a strong-willed woman.
Oh, yes.
And he and remained that to her dying day.
Yes, we know this.
Interestingly, her grave, as you may know, it says, "End of construction. Thank you for your patience." So
I've been there.
She
yes.
didn't like.
Yeah.
He told her, "Now, if we're going to go together, you'll do what I say." And she bristled at that, and didn't. I think it'd be unfair to say she knuckled under, but so there was that little bit of a rocky period, and even shortly after they were married, he had to go on she was sick, and he had to go to a preaching engagement, and instead of calling to cancel it and stay by the bedside of his new bride, he checked her into a local hospital and kept the appointment and sent her a telegram and a box of candy. And she felt hurt, but she learned then that nothing came before preaching on her husband's list of priorities.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. William Martin. And let me identify for those of you that would like to read this new book coming out. It'll be out just in a few weeks, even less than that, actually. And it is an updated version of A Prophet with Honor. William C. Martin is the author. Of course, he wrote the one back in 1991, but of course, a lot has happened since then. And it's an extensive book, and one that we would encourage you to find more out about because it's on our website. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, a wise consumer of news and information should question some of the statistics thrown out by journalists. This is especially true since an advocacy group may have provided these statistics in order to influence public opinion. Here's one example. Tulane University says that 41% of the undergraduate women have been sexually assaulted since arriving on campus. That's an alarming statistic that seems to be contrary to common sense. If there were that many assaults, we would be hearing about what a dangerous place this college is to any woman. When you dig into the statistics, you find that Tulane broadly defines sexual assault. We're talking about any unwanted sexual contact. The survey also includes lots of people who were self-selecting themselves for the survey. Just a bit of skepticism and discernment would tell you that the 41% figure could not possibly be correct. Another example has been the statistics for school shootings. Even before the tragic shooting in Florida, there were people questioning the criteria used to compile school shooting incidents. Daniel Lee, writing in the Wall Street Journal, challenged the claim that there had been 11 school shootings just in the month of January. The only one some might remember was a shooting at a Kentucky high school. But what about the other 10? Well, if you look at the database put together by a gun control group, you see lots of incidents that don't qualify as a school shooting. A school bus window was broken by a pellet gun in Iowa. A gun accidentally discharged in a weapons class in a Texas community college. A veteran with PTSD shot himself in a parking lot of a closed Michigan school. No students were present. The point is simple. Don't trust every statistic. We need some healthy skepticism and discernment when it comes to news and information. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13. Samson, now playing. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, we're going to give you a little more history of Billy Graham, but I'd love to hear your comments about the influence Billy Graham has had on your life, so we'll take those phone calls in just a few minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us today Dr. William Martin, and again, as we've mentioned, in the past he has been very well known for a number of books, but this one in particular, A Prophet with Honor, which came out many, many years ago, decades ago, literally, but a new version of that, an updated version coming out, and certainly wanted to identify that. And if you are interested in that, you could either advance order it or at least look for it in your local bookstore. It'll be coming out shortly. And again, we have all sorts of information, so you can get it in hardcover, paperback, or Kindle. And I think at the passing of Billy Graham, it might be good to come back and kind of reflect on his life and the legacy of his. We, of course, will be talking about his family, but yesterday we talked about everything from Christianity Today, the founding of various organizations, not to mention the Billy Graham Crusade itself and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, as well as things like ECFA and a variety of others. So we'll get into that. But let's first of all spend some time talking about the marriage, because your piece yesterday, Divorce, Drugs, Drinking, Billy Graham's Children, and Their Absent Father. When Billy Graham became a full-time evangelist in 1945, he traveled a great deal, and I think to his pain, he was not there for his kids, and so even more so, his children have said that on a number of occasions. So what have you learned as being the biographer of Billy Graham in terms of that phase of his life?
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about this. I would like to say that the title I gave that piece was Growing Up Graham.
And we wondered about that. We've already talked about how you don't always get your title. As a matter of fact, two of us wondered if that was really your title, because it's a really nice article, but the headline is just a stab in the gut a little bit. So thanks for sharing that.
I felt that as well. And it's also the case that, well, I'll just go ahead and talk about the article. You said it's a really nice one, so I'll accept that. I think so, too. But I understand when people saw that, a few people got their back up.
Yeah.
Actually,
more because of the title. Once you go through it, you're telling the story, and that's what a biographer does, right?
Right. Actually, it was supposed to be a companion piece to a longer obit that I decided at the last moment, last week. I've got to rewrite this. So much has already been done. And Tuesday, I sat down and said, I'm going to finish this revised larger piece this week. And yesterday morning, that ended. So this was, anyway, it originally, well, yes, let's go ahead and talk about the article.
But again, the point is that he was traveling, and I'll be fair to say that some of us that have been hands-on parents and always have been home for our kids every night, we've still seen some of the other issues. So to be fair, sometimes this was not just a problem with Billy Graham, but Ruth Graham will tell you that this was hard, especially Franklin Graham caused all sorts of challenges, and Ruth and Gigi and some of them. So you've, over the years, seen what has happened to the next generation. I think it's amazing how well many of them have turned out, given the fact that they really did, to be honest, have an absent father, and they were in the public eye all of the time, weren't they?
Yes, they were. People expected, well, these are Billy Graham's children. They ought to be just perfect, and in fact, they weren't. They weren't really troublemakers, certainly as small children, but they did notice their father's absence. They had, fortunately, Ruth's parents, the Bells, lived in Montreat where they lived across. In fact, that's why the Grahams moved to Montreat, because her father and mother were there. Mm-hmm. And so they served as a father figure for the children. But and actually, one said, Granddaddy was such a father figure, it didn't hit me that it was all that unusual. I thought everybody's daddy was gone. But still, Ruth talked about one of the girls sitting out on the lawn, and an airplane flew over, and she says, bye, Daddy, because the plane meant that Daddy was going. And then another time where Franklin, his father came in, and Franklin says, who he?
Yes, that was pretty sad when I read that in your piece here too today. But again, those are some of the realities of people in the public eye. And you think about what has happened to some of the kids who were kids of presidents, and they're in the public eye for 4 years or 8 years, and how they didn't turn out so well. In a sense, the Graham family has always been in the public eye, really since about 1945, and many of these kids grew up in the public eye. There were expectations placed upon them, and if I can say, having at least gotten to know people like Franklin Graham and Graham Lotz and others, and Gigi a little bit, they've really turned out pretty well in light of all the pressures that were placed upon them.
I think there's no doubt that that's true, and I wish that there was one article, one line was taken out of that piece at the end, and it had Ruth, who had been the most critical of the children, saying that she was always aware there was always that core of love, and they never wavered from it. She says, I admire that, I aspire to that. And those were the closing lines that I wanted.
Well, nothing else. We're giving people an insight in what happens. I've written newspaper columns and recognize that sometimes they don't show up the way you expect them, and that was helpful. Let's spend some time talking about 12 U.S. presidents. We'll get to Nixon, because that's the one that I think was the greatest pain and one of the reasons why we were quoting you yesterday. But this is remarkable. As some people have said, there will never be another person like Billy Graham, in that from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, he has been a spiritual counselor, some more for others than others, but still an individual that has had a profound influence, at least in the spiritual realm, in the lives of a dozen U.S. presidents. That's pretty remarkable.
Well, it's extraordinary. It truly is. And it over that long a period, it took a man of great integrity to be able to, presidents would pass along word. They would have, if he if he had leaked things that he took, betrayed confidences, things like that, if he hadn't proved himself to be absolutely trustworthy and safe with a secret, that word would have been passed from president to president. But instead, I suspect that, and I know in some cases, but I suspect that they told their successor, if you need help, Billy Graham will be there for you, and you can trust him. But certainly, he proved himself to be trustworthy, and the fact that he was so well known and so well respected, it didn't hurt the presidents to be his friend. It was that if Billy Graham was your friend, then you must be a good person. If he likes your policies, they must be good policies. And perhaps you're even a Christian person, and these are Christian policies. So he liked having the presidents as his friends. Evangelicals liked having their man walking in the halls of power. But it's also the case that the presidents got benefits from that as well. And, of course, I think it did them good to have Billy Graham around them and giving them counsel and just friendship.
And again, it's just hard to imagine anything like that now. You had a group that was surrounding President Barack Obama. You have a very different group surrounding President Donald Trump, but you don't have any of that kind of commonality. But we do need to take a break, and when we come back, I do want to talk about Richard Nixon. That's one of the reasons we spent some time yesterday talking about if there was never really a scandal, not a sex scandal, financial scandal, anything like that with the Billy Graham organization, but if there was a regret. You can see it on the face of Billy Graham when that has ever come up. Whenever the name Richard Nixon comes up, you could sense that this was one of the greatest regrets. So we're going to talk about that, and at the same time also give you a chance to join the conversation as well, because we are talking about the passing of what many people have called, and even today, USA Today called America's pastor, and an individual that from the time that he really kind of felt the call to ministry, and then by 1945 really became a full-time evangelist, traveled the world, and we've heard different numbers for the number of people that have heard his message. Also heard numbers on the order of like 3 million people that have become Christians because of his evangelistic crusades. By the way, for a while he stopped calling them crusades because of the concern that it might be offensive to Muslims, but they changed that pretty quickly. And, of course, at one time been calling them campaigns, but didn't want to relate that to World War II. So there have been a few changes, and we'll get into that. But also the one kind of embarrassing event that related to Billy Graham as he was the spiritual counselor to Richard Nixon. And if you'd like to join our conversation today, maybe you have some comments or questions, we are privileged to have with us today the biographer of Billy Graham. And if you are not already familiar with the book, A Prophet with Honor, it was out for many years back in the 1990s, and now Zondervan is going to release it again. And we have a link so that you can find out more about it. I'm sure you'll see it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link so you can get it in hardback, paperback, or Kindle. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have Dr. William Martin with us. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Number of callers coming through, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, focusing a little more time and attention on the passing of Billy Graham and learning quite a bit from the biographer of Billy Graham, who is with us, Dr. William Martin. The book is entitled A Prophet with Honor, coming out shortly with Zondervan. We have all sorts of links on our website. And when to talk about the presidents for just a minute, that's kind of intriguing as well. Started meeting with Harry Truman, played golf with Gerald Ford, as we mentioned yesterday, went swimming with Lyndon Johnson, vacation with George Herbert Walker Bush. And by the way, that was where I also think he spent some time with George W. Bush. George W. Bush actually said that it was a conversation with Billy Graham that turned him from his drinking ways when he was young. Also spent the first night of office with Richard Nixon in the White House. One off-air asked, well, did Billy Graham ever meet with Barack Obama? I've got a picture here. You can find it in USA Today of Barack Obama, President Barack Obama, meeting with Billy Graham at the evangelist's home. It was a little less of a formal meeting than some of the others, but nevertheless, I think certainly counts. But while I mentioned Richard Nixon, Dr. William Martin, let's talk about Richard Nixon, because if there was a regret, it almost always shows on the face of Billy Graham. If you've ever seen him being interviewed and the words Richard Nixon come up, you can see in his countenance that that was one of his greatest regrets. Tell us the story, if you might.
Well, they became friends during the Eisenhower presidency because Nixon was Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. And they became actually quite good friends. And he expected that, he thought, well, certainly he expected him to be the Republican candidate, which he was. He was also fearful of John Kennedy because, as much as anything, because of his Catholicism, which was a much stronger sense in the 1950s than it is now. And he even secretly, and that was not revealed at the time when I wrote the book, but he had met with Norman Vincent Peale and others to try to get major Christian leaders to oppose John Kennedy rather secretly. But in any case, after Nixon lost, and he stayed in touch with Nixon because they were still good friends, and later on, when it came time to run again, he was considering it, and Billy Graham told him, you know, if you don't do it, you'll always wonder if you should have. So Nixon ran and won, and then he saw that Billy Graham was a great asset. And throughout Nixon's presidency, Billy Graham invited Richard Nixon to his 1970 Knoxville crusade, which gave him a positive identification with Graham. Graham played a leading role in Honor America Day, which was a patriotic extravaganza in Washington on July 4th, and then Nixon served as a star attraction at Billy Graham Day in Charlotte the next year. In many ways, they just got along very, very well, but it's also the case that Billy Graham didn't realize it, but Nixon and his organization were using him. And
yes.
First of all, it was hard for him to believe because he said he would not do anything that was trying to do anything illegal or to use me, certainly not. But after Watergate, Graham's first response to that was to say, well, Nixon wouldn't have done that. I just don't believe he would do it. But as the evidence came to light, he acknowledged he said, confused and sick about the whole thing, but said he was sure the president wasn't seriously involved because his moral and ethical principles wouldn't allow him to do anything illegal about that. And when he finally finally read the transcripts of the White House tapes in the late spring of 1974, what he found there devastated him. He wept, he threw up, and he almost lost his innocence about Richard Nixon. But interestingly, he was more troubled by the profanity than by political espionage and suborning perjury and bribery and other strikes at constitutional government. The most poignant time, and the whole time that I worked on the biography, I saved the questions about the presidency, about the presidents, and particularly about Nixon, until what I expected to be and was the last long period where I would spend hours and hours with him. And I had, in my interviews before that, I had read and gone through things and looked at films and gone to the Nixon archives and interviewed people. But I'd saved that relationship to last because I knew it'd be touchy and difficult.
Yes.
And there were some people in the organization who thought I shouldn't have included that material, but of course there was no choice about that. So we talked about Nixon particularly and Watergate and how he'd been misled. And I had found and shown to him ahead of time memos, talking points, other things in Nixon's archives that he wasn't aware existed. And what they amounted to was, we've got to work on Billy Graham, and here's what we need to get him to do and the questions we need to ask. Essentially, they said, here's the way we're using Billy Graham. And Charles Colson told me when I interviewed him years ago, well, of course we used him. That's what we did with people. John Ehrlichman and H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, talked to me about that in a similar vein. Well, Mr. Graham said to me on that afternoon, it was a late afternoon, he said, I couldn't believe some of those memos that you showed me until I saw them. And that included some of the things that he himself had said. And he put his arms back on the couch, both directions, and he said, I knew what I had said to the president, and I knew what he'd said to me, but when I read all those memos that had been circulating in the background, I felt like a sheep led to the slaughter.
Wow.
I had presented him with materials that had pained him deeply, and instead of denying it, he was absorbing the force of it. I don't have a moment that sticks with me any more clearly than that one, and it was quite poignant.
And again, another reason to read this updated version of A Prophet with Honor, because a lot has happened since 1991. Along the way, I do want to take some phone calls, and so let's see if we can get a few of those. We'll go to Missouri, KNEO. Mike, you're on with Dr. William Martin.
Yes. It's just, when I was in college, I'm about the same age as you, so, my mom goes, oh, you got to watch Billy Graham. It's Crusades on. And I go, oh, really? I don't really want to do that. But anyway, she kind of turned me on to. But one thing I could say about Billy Graham, he had one message, and it was good. So.
I understand that your mother had some kind of correspondence with Ruth Graham. Is that true?
Yes, she did. I've got some books, I got some letters, and Ruth was just your local mom.
Interesting.
She, it was really good. And actually, I still got those.
Let me ask you about that for just a minute, Dr. Martin. It does seem to me that one of the themes that I see coming out time and time again on some of the tributes that people have written about Billy Graham is his humility. Of course, we can also talk about the humility of Ruth Bell, who became Ruth Bell Graham. They were quite willing to sometimes write letters, interact with individuals, do some things that people that reach a level of kind of international status would never think about doing. Is that what you found?
That is true, and there's another aspect that's related to that I think stands out from a lot of the evangelists that have made headlines, at least in recent decades. People would write to Billy Graham, and they would get a personal written letter back. Now, of course, the letter, there was a whole staff of people who wrote the letters.
Sure.
And they were drawing on some of them, stock, what's the word? Anyway, stock sentences and answers to common questions.
Yeah, like form letters, yeah. But
yes, when they were, boilerplate was the word I was thinking.
Boilerplate, sure. Mm-hmm.
They didn't say, this is from Billy Graham. They said, we have written to Mr. Graham, and as you can understand, he gets thousands and thousands of letters, and he cannot answer all of these personally, but I'm telling you things that he would say. And so they didn't try to say, I read every letter and I pray over every letter. Billy Graham didn't say that, but he was still giving a more personal kind of response than the people who say, I take all of your letters and pray over them, and you are dear to me, so forth. I thought there was integrity that didn't allow him to dissemble in the ways that a number of people who have large mail fundraising direct mail service.
Well, and certainly, again, the only address you need is Minneapolis, Minnesota, and all the other things that those of us a little bit older might remember. Let's take a break, though, and when we come back, we have a few more phone calls real quickly. We are privileged to have with us Dr. William Martin, and again, just let me identify a book coming out shortly. It is an updated version of A Prophet with Honor. William C. Martin is our guest, and he is the author of that book coming out with Zondervan. Of course, that original book came out in 1991. This one, 800 pages. Lots to read and lots to absorb. We'll do our best to just try to finish off here and do at least a little bit of honor towards Billy Graham today. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Sometimes we think that the judicial system can and will solve all of our disputes. A recent case from the Court of Appeals of Ohio says there are some things even a court cannot decide. A Roman Catholic institution in Ohio recently dismissed a student studying for the priesthood following an investigation into allegations of moral misconduct. The student, understandably upset, sued the school for breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and other charges. On appeal, the state court in Ohio explained that courts may only adjudicate those matters involving a subject matter courts are authorized to consider. Courts are permitted to evaluate secular disputes, but the doctrine of ecclesiastical abstention prevents courts from settling disputes involving purely doctrinal and ecclesiastical matters. Here, the court explained, all of the claims alleged stemmed from a dispute by a religious organization over matters of church doctrine. Any resolution would, necessarily, require the court to evaluate religious doctrine, a task courts that are ill-prepared to undertake. The judicial system has broad jurisdiction over matters ranging from simple misdemeanors to complex commercial transactions. Yet it is right and proper that courts have limits. The ecclesiastical abstention doctrine highlights those limitations, showcasing along the way the inherent deference that courts have for religious bodies to govern their own religious affairs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Learn more and request a free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org and get your free In God We Trust window cling.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Billy Graham, some 77 million saw him preach in person, while nearly 215 million more watched his crusades, and those are numbers that some people are using. I've seen different numbers in different places, but just gives you a little bit of a sense of the impact of Billy Graham. We are privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Dr. William Martin, and he is the author of a book coming out. It is the updated version of A Prophet with Honor. Let's go back to South Carolina. In this case, Marlene, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you very much for hearing me. I was telling your control person that I do disagree with a few points, and one of them is I'm wondering, two people can't be true. I'm wondering when Dr. Martin made the statement about Billy Graham is one of the first preachers or pastors to integrate in this congregation. Now, I've seen videos of all his preaching way back, way back, the black and whites, and yes, his audience was that way. But A.A. Allen, a well-known evangelist back in the 40s, 30s and 40s and 50s, I believe, also made that same statement. So, I mean, both men are claiming the same thing, and both men show that the congregations are integrated. They're not segregated, so I don't know which one is true. Another point that I wanted to make out is I think for just as many people that are praising Billy Graham for all his work, I mean, like I said, I've watched all this on TV. There are equally a lot of people who have written against him. One of the things is there is a book out by a female author. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you the title or not, but there is a book out by the female author that talks about Billy Graham having very heavy connections to the Catholic Church. And when somebody did go up in one of his crusades to accept Jesus Christ as their Savior, what they were doing, his helpers in the audience up along the front, were telling people, you know, okay, they said the sinner's prayer, whatever, but they also sent them back to their original church, even if it was a Catholic church. I personally have a problem with that, and I never really paid attention to it till I did read some of this book. I never really paid attention to it, and then all of a sudden I realized, yeah, that's what they're doing, because we're supposed to come out. We're supposed to be separate. Once you turn your life over to God, why go back to something that you know is a known heresy?
Okay, let's go to Dr. Martin, because, first of all, the segregation issue is one that he ended, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But he was also not only criticized in the South for having integrated crusades, he was oftentimes criticized, for example, in the New York rallies and others, because he did welcome Catholics and Protestants together, correct?
That's true, and that was an evolution in his ministry. When he held the crusade in 1957 in Madison Square Garden all summer long, not only did Catholics not part of it, the diocese told Catholic priests to preach against him.
Yes.
But over the years, Billy Graham began, I think the book you're talking about that's way overdrawn. But over the years, Billy Graham did begin to send people, if they came forward and said they wanted to go to a Catholic church, they would send those inquirer cards to the Catholic Church. That is true. And toward the end of his ministry, particularly in his crusade in New York in September 1991, just after the book had come out, large numbers of Catholic priests and nuns and other Catholics participated in the crusade as counselors. And this was a hard pill for people in the organization to swallow for a long time. But Mr. Graham was not willing to say Catholics are not Christians. People can disagree with that, but he made a conscious decision there. I don't think that doesn't amount to strong ties to the Catholic Church, or that he was being manipulated or controlled by the Catholic Church. Back to the first question, what I said was that Billy Graham first integrated his own crusades in 1951, taking the ropes off of the section that divided white from colored when he was in Chattanooga. Not that he was the first. You're absolutely right. I don't know that A.A. Allen was the first, but A.A. Allen and a number of Pentecostal preachers, starting back from when Pentecostalism in the first part of the century got really started, one of its appeals from the beginning was that there was no racial barrier. I went to an A.A. Allen service in early 1970s, maybe late 60s, and I was amazed or impressed that it was about 1/3 white, 1/3 brown, 1/3 black. And that was actually pretty typical of the Pentecostal revivalists.
Wow. Let's see if we can get in one more phone call just before we run out of time. In North Carolina, WLGP. Andrea, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Hey, thanks, Kerby. Very important conversation, thank you. It's so hard to talk about someone like Billy Graham, isn't it? I just want to ask really about, okay, it's cool, he's a dairy farmer's son. I would like for the author there, and you as well, to speak on the theology. Billy Sunday, Billy Graham met the Lord Jesus when he was 16 or around there. I'd like to hear about who influenced him to come to Christ.
Okay, real quickly.
Well, he started out in a very deeply religious home. And when evangelists would come through, they often stayed at his home. Revivalists would come through, they'd stay at his home while they were holding a revival in town. So he was reared in an extremely conservative and devout family. His brother said, we weren't allowed to go out to play till we'd memorized our Bible verses, and always went to church. So that was part of his life, and he's often said it was not that he had this kind of dramatic event that made him decide to be a Christian. It was more making a decision that he accepted Christ, and he wanted to, he wanted that to be the forefront of his life. And there were times when he had significant religious experiences, but I think he came to Christ by growing up in a Christian home.
Certainly. And of course, his focus on tent crusades and tent revivals and open-air evangelism came from where he became a Christian, walking that aisle. So that was part of it as well. We talked about, of course, William Randolph Hearst, Puff Graham, and where it goes from there. So I am excited that this new book is coming out, and thank you for the work that you've done to add to everything that was in the 1991 version. I haven't gotten a copy of it in my hands yet, but thank you for... Yeah, go ahead.
There are 4 new chapters. There are 4 new chapters bringing it up through the inauguration of Donald Trump. And you said 800 pages. That's true, but more than 100 of them are footnotes.
Okay. Well, and I knew there'd be a lot of footnotes. Dr. Martin, I've enjoyed, I've been in your class. I think it's been decades since I've been in your class, but appreciate you being with us today. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
We are going to take a break, and tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. There's just an opportunity for you to maybe make a few more comments about Billy Graham, and so we certainly encourage you to do that. Last time I was in William Martin's class is 1980s. Okay, that is a while ago. Nick Pitts was just born then, so that goes back a long way. But nevertheless, this is an individual that has been the biography of Billy Graham, and as he said, 800 pages, well, maybe 100 pages or footnotes, still about 700 pages, everything and more that you've ever wanted to know about Billy Graham in this new book coming out. And I really want to thank Zondervan for making that possible so that we can educate a whole new generation about the legacy of Billy Graham and the Graham Organization. If you want to know a little bit more about the book by Craig Parshall, the upcoming book by William Martin, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. I hope that you will click on that button that says donate, because after all, you've probably heard some things here today that you've heard nowhere else. So we appreciate that and certainly encourage your financial support. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Tomorrow, weekend edition. We'll see you back here on Point of View right then.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed, and